I've always been someone who loved the outdoors. Even as a kid growing up in a small city, my parents would have to yell my name from the porch to get me to come in at night. I grew up when the internet was still a relatively new thing. You had to use dial-up to get connected. Now, some of you hearing this can probably hear the sound just by me mentioning the words dial-up. Anyway, the story I'm about to share takes place 10 to 12 years ago. I was with my girlfriend at the time, who I'd met in college. It was serious, but it was an on-off-again relationship. In all honesty, it was full of childish drama, and I was super immature at that point. We made plans to attend a local fair or carnival or whatever you want to call it, with some family and friends. We actually had a decently sized group, so we decided we would all drive there separately. That way we could have several cars ready, and everyone could leave whenever they wanted to. I'm not usually a drinker. Even back in my college years, alcohol has always given me really bad anxiety. Because of that, I usually just avoid it. For whatever reason though, this particular night I was in a real good mood and actually felt like drinking. I was having a bunch with my girlfriend's dad, and we were giving each other the old, "Hey, how long is it going to take you to finish that?" or "This is already my second one, and you're only on your first," that kind of thing. After, I don't know, maybe the third or fourth drink, my girlfriend comes up in front of everyone and says something along the lines of, "Are you guys gonna slow down? I think you need to relax." Something like that. I honestly don't remember much of anything. What I do remember is acting very poorly and basically pouting because I was annoyed and embarrassed she had to tell me that. Again, I was super immature at this time. I remember then just completely shutting down, not being rude to anyone, but only giving one-word answers and being very antisocial. I remember she even came up to me with a beer to apologize, which I declined and continued with the cold shoulder. You know, thinking back on it, I'm not even really sure why I was so mad or why I reacted that way. After walking around for another hour, I said I was gonna take off and head home. Since I didn't drive and had been drinking as well, my girlfriend asked me, "Well, how are you gonna get home then?" I said I had a friend that was coming to get me, and I just walked off and left the fair. I walked over to the parking lot. Now, a ways back from this lot was a forest, and behind that I believe there were some farms or something. It was still pretty light out, so I figured I would just walk into the woods and clear my mind a bit, get out of this crappy mood I seemed to be stuck in. After heading out into the woods for what I thought would be a quick walk though, I started getting extremely hot. I don't know if it was because I was feeling a buzz from the drinks or because it was actually getting hotter outside, but the longer I trampled in the woods, the more embarrassed I felt about my actions. I was realizing how I'd acted and figured I would head back to the fair to see if everyone was still there. After walking for about 15 minutes though, I realized I no longer knew where I was. I was completely lost, and I could not find the path back to the parking lot. I stayed calm and tried to analyze my surroundings. Was anything sticking out? I started to move to where I thought I'd heard a sound. I realized quickly though, I had no idea what I was doing, where I was going. I was stuck here with no one around to help me. I pulled out my phone. Even though I had a bunch of text messages, my texts or calls wouldn't go through. There didn't seem to be any service in this area. After sitting on the dirt and thinking for several minutes, I started to think that maybe the best idea was just to wait until nightfall and see if someone would find me. I didn't want to go even deeper into the woods on accident, not knowing where I was. Besides, surely I'd be able to see the lights from the fair and make my way back then. I would have cell service and call for a ride home. As the sun began to set and dusk started to set in, I became more and more uneasy. I noticed every little sound, a branch breaking, the wind shaking the trees around me. As it got darker and darker, I swore I began to hear voices as well. I would twist my neck so fast, thinking I'd just heard something that sounded like voices getting closer and closer. Then though, there would be complete silence. Everything was so quiet. My heart jumped out of my chest though when I heard someone clearly yell, "There they are! Get them!" I started running. I didn't know where I was going, but I just ran. I was bumping into trees, taking branches across the face. I tripped and fell too. The second time I stumbled over a log, I decided to just stay still. I laid down as quietly as I could, trying to see if I'd gotten away from whoever was screaming and seemingly looking for me. Why they were chasing me, I wasn't sure. Was I just being paranoid? How would anyone even know I was out here sitting and waiting for dark? After a few minutes of silence, I heard footsteps walking over leaves and branches cracking. People were talking to each other. The only thing I remember hearing is, "She expects us to get him," something like that. Once I heard those voices trail off back in another direction, I began slowly walking. It had become very dark, and I wasn't able to see any lights as of yet. After what I assumed to have been 5 to 10 minutes though, I started to see a faint glow in the distance. As I moved closer to it, I began to hear the murmurs of life. As soon as I realized that was the way to the fair, I sprinted as fast as I could. I don't think I'd ever been that scared in my entire life. I always look back on that experience, wondering if there really was anything to be scared about though. Who were those people in the woods? Were they even looking for me, or was it just a coincidence? Maybe it was someone just being an idiot. I don't know. Whatever it was, when I'm out hiking or in the woods, I always feel like I see something in my peripherals, even though I know nothing's there. I always make sure to be back home by dark. I never want to be stuck like that again. I've been dating my boyfriend now for over 4 years. We're planning to get married eventually, but we're both waiting to finish school first. The first year we were dating, my boyfriend and his little sister tragically lost their parents. For their sake, I'm not going to go into details about that, but ever since then, my boyfriend has assumed responsibility for his sister. Since he's 28 and she's only 16, he's been a sort of father figure and mentor for her for the past couple of years. She's a great kid, but given her age, she had an extremely hard time coping with the loss. I could never blame her for that, since we'd been together for so long now. I tried to give his sister some guidance whenever I could, and help to create a loving household for her. Since we're all students, we often stretch our budget as much as we can. When she turned 16, all she wanted to do was get her permit so she could get her license. We did everything we could to make that happen, and even though she eventually did get her license, unfortunately we couldn't afford to get her a car just yet. I started saving up a little bit of money from every check, and so did my boyfriend. Eventually, we had a couple $1,000s on our side, and we're planning on buying a car for her birthday. I knew it wouldn't be like a great car, but I bet it would be nicer than no car at all. He suggested looking on Facebook Marketplace, which seemed like a great idea to me. Tons of cheap vehicles, some garbage, but a few nice ones. When we inquired about the decent cars, they were all either sold or got no response. Finally though, after about a week of trying, we got at least a message back. Some guy named Howard messaged me about the 2013 Chevy Cruze for $2,100. The pictures made the car look pretty pristine. He told us in the message that the car ran great. It had been his stepmother's and she'd moved out of state without taking it with her. Apparently, she told him to sell off her stuff that she didn't need so he wouldn't have to keep it around. They'd split the profits 50-50. I didn't really care about all the backstory though. As long as they sold me a working car for my sister-in-law, it would be just fine. We set up a time to meet, and if we liked the car, we told them we would buy it that very day. He told us to come over sometime after 8 p.m., since that's when he'd be getting off work. That worked out well enough for us since both of us had classes during the day anyway. Obviously, we did not tell his sister about this. She was at a friend's house that night, so we made the drive to go see the car. It was kind of far away, but we didn't really care if the car was as good as this guy said it was. Hell, we would have driven hours to get there if we needed to. We got to the address he'd given, and it was nearly pitch black. The house was in the middle of nowhere, and it looked completely decrepit and abandoned. I'm talking like boards in the windows, boards on the doors. Clearly no one had lived there for a long time. My boyfriend can be a complete idiot sometimes, though. I told him I didn't think we were in the right place. He said he thought we were, and maybe this guy was just super poor or something. I messaged Howard and said, "Hey, we're here, but I don't think this looks like anyone else is here." About a minute later, he responded, "Oh, hey, yeah, I'm just finishing up getting the title for the car and everything like that. Why don't you come on inside and I'll take you out back to see it." I told my boyfriend I really didn't like this. Something about this seemed really weird. He just wants to see the good in people, though, and told me not to worry. I begged him not to go inside, but he didn't listen to me. He offered me to stay in the car since I didn't feel safe, so that's exactly what I did. When he got up to the door and walked in, I could see a faint light coming from inside, which did help me to feel a little bit better. I got out of the car and moved to the driver's seat. I wanted to be able to drive away in a hurry just in case something happened. While I was getting into the car, though, I heard yelling coming from the house and a sort of loud thud combined with the sound of something breaking. I froze, staring at the dark house. Seconds later, my boyfriend ran outside. He was screaming for me to drive right now. That memory of him screaming for his life still cuts me up inside. It makes me sick. He basically dove into the passenger seat as 4 men rushed out of the house. My boyfriend wasn't saying anything other than screaming to drive. I drove extremely fast out of there until we finally got to a more suburban part of town. At that point, he finally began to catch his breath. That's when he told me what happened. He'd walked in, and before he could get any words out, someone had hit him over the head with something. He instinctively turned around and pushed someone to the ground. That was the loud thud I'd heard. After that, he instantly ran to the car. He didn't even realize there'd been more than one guy until he saw all 4 of them come rushing out. As we drove off, obviously that post had been removed. We really had no proof of anything. We did have a couple of screenshots of the car, but the license plate wasn't in the screenshot. Most likely the picture was fake anyway. We still reported this, but nothing ever happened. It gives me nightmares, thinking about the possibility of how many times this sort of thing has worked. I always hoped that nobody would fall for these sorts of tricks, but I'm not so naive as to believe that nobody ever does. All I can hope is that somehow, some way, these horrible people got what was coming to them, and nobody else had to endure the same nightmare we did, or even worse. So, breakups suck. We all know that. Not so long ago, I broke up with an ex of nearly 10 years. It had been over long before then, but I have a hard time ending things. She's a very sensitive person, so whenever the subject of ending things came up over the years, let's just say she would go into full shutdown mode. I realized eventually that prolonging the relationship was just making things worse for the both of us. I didn't really understand before that, though. I also want to mention, to protect everyone's privacy, that I won't be using the real names or locations in the story. I'm still close with her family, and they've already dealt with enough in their life. I don't want to bring more stress in there. When I finally ended things with her for good, it went about as well as you might imagine. She took it horribly, and it was a few rough weeks of fighting, crying, and even some threats. Eventually, though, the split was final. She moved in with her aunt, who lived about an hour away. I think so, at least. I'm not exactly sure since I stayed in the house. I ended up giving her a lot of the furniture, which was fine with me. I make decent enough money that I could afford some new couches and whatnot. I didn't have to be stingy and just keep everything to be petty or whatever. I planned on going to one of the big chains to get all my new furniture, but in the short term, I needed something in my house to sit on, since I would be living there after all. For now, I was watching TV in a lawn chair. I looked on Marketplace to see if I could find anyone who was just trying to get rid of some furniture. What I found was a super ugly yellow love seat. I know that sounds disgusting, but I have this weird fascination with ugly yellow. I was all about this. The most exciting thing to me, though, was that the woman was selling it for only $40. It almost looked like it had never been sat on before. I messaged the woman and set up a time to see this love seat. She lived about 40 minutes away, but I didn't really mind. I drove out to the small house that sat in a sort of semi-secluded area. I knocked on the door and a kindly elderly woman answered. I told her I was there for the love seat, but to my surprise, she looked extremely scared. She screamed that she didn't know who I was or what I was talking about. Then she slammed the door in my face. I went back to my car and checked the address in my messages. This was clearly the address, so I messaged the woman and told her I was there. I also told the seller that she'd closed the door on me. The woman responded several minutes later. "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, that's my grandmother. I live in the garage out back. Why don't you just take a walk around and come on in?" I was a little bit annoyed, but I wanted that love seat. I made my way to the garage that was in the backyard, as she'd said. I knocked on the door, and a sort of muffled voice responded. "Come in." I walked in, looked around, but I didn't see a love seat anywhere. In fact, the inside seemed to be just a normal garage. I shouted out hello, but I didn't get any answer. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, from an adjacent room, a small person charged at me. This figure had enough element of surprise on me that she was able to jump at me and knock me off my feet. She was wearing something on her head. It was dark in the garage, so I wasn't able to see her face. She was yelling and screaming, and finally, whatever was on there came off. I saw it was my ex-girlfriend. I'm not even joking. I was so flabbergasted I was finally able to push her off just out of sheer shock. Instead of running, though, I got up and started yelling, "What the hell are you doing?" Her tone changed instantly, from erratic to crying. I was hesitant. I didn't know if I should try and console her, even though I was furious and very confused. She was uncontrollably sobbing. I was trying to calm her down so I could leave. That's when it happened. She pulled out a box cutter or something like that and stabbed me in the shoulder. In that moment, I screamed, wincing in pain. I grabbed the small blade and ripped it out of my shoulder. I tossed it on the ground. In the 10 years of knowing this woman, I'd never seen her act or sound like this. She grabbed the blade up once more and started to stab at the air in front of me. I think she was trying to actually contact with me, but between all of her sobbing, she couldn't properly aim. I was able to get to my feet and run to my vehicle screaming. I called the police and informed them of what happened. They showed up pretty quickly, and thank God she was arrested. Getting attacked was horrifying, but watching someone I really cared about and loved being taken away by the police was even more traumatic. I watched as she got put in the back of the police car. This was not the same woman I used to be in love with. I still can't believe her plan had actually worked. There was no guarantee I would ever check Marketplace for furniture, but in the end I did. I guess she knew I would be attracted to this ugly yellow couch if I did so. She was right. She'd told me she was moving in with her aunt, which I guess was true. Her aunt lived several houses down from this poor elderly woman who was not related to the incident at all. She had to deal with the fallout of all this nonsense. The last thing I knew, she was being moved to a facility to get treatment. I decided not to press criminal charges. I'm even helping with some of her medical bills. Sometimes the people closest to us can cause us the most harm. I don't know what went wrong in her brain that made her think that attacking me seemed like some sort of solution. I do feel terrible for her. It seemed like she couldn't entirely control it. I hope that she gets all the help she needs and gets better in the end. The events of this story still make me think back to that night, and I'm still trying to process exactly what happened. The events that took place on this strange night were about 10 years ago from the moment I'm writing this story. My friends and I were 17 years old and spent most of our weekends with each other. It was a habit that started back in elementary school, playing video games and sleeping at each other's houses all throughout middle school and high school. This was our every weekend routine. At some point during senior year, though, we decided we wanted to mix things up a little bit. We would take a little bit of a night drive. It was myself who had a license and a car at this point, and my two friends, Robbie and Scott. My parents really trusted us. All things considered, we were very good kids. The night started out like most of our other nights. Scott and Robbie showed up at the house to sleep over. We ordered some pizza, played some video games, and talked about random things for a while. Shortly after 11 p.m., we decided to go for a ride. Really for no other reason than to listen to some music and exchange some old-fashioned conversation. We drove for a while, turning down random roads we didn't even know existed. Before we knew it, we'd been driving for several hours. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen any streetlights. It was extremely dark and desolate wherever we'd ended up driving to. Around 1, maybe a bit later, we were driving down this really eerie and very poorly lit road. As we approached, I noticed a car that was on the side of the road. It wasn't parked though. It was kind of crooked and jutting into the street. The hood was tucked into the shrubs, almost as if the car had lost control and gotten into an accident. The red taillights were still softly glowing on the road. Robbie suggested we take a look, just in case someone fell asleep at the wheel or had a medical incident or something bad. If someone really had gotten into trouble, it would take hours for paramedics to find them if we didn't do something right now. We slowly and cautiously approached the vehicle. It was an older red Honda Civic. We got out of our car slowly and began to approach this red car. Robbie called out in the bravest voice he could muster, "Hey, anybody there? Are you hurt?" There was no response. As we got closer, I shouted to wait. While we were walking over, I began to make out some type of figures in the back seat, just sitting upright. Robbie shouted again, this time with a bit more urgency in his voice. "Hey, are you okay?" Again, there was no response, no noise at all, except for the motor of our car running several feet behind us. After a moment, Robbie finally said, "Oh, whatever." He approached the red car, and we followed closely behind him. I felt like something was wrong in my gut, though. We were all shaken with immediate fear as we got closer to the window and realized what this was. There was, in fact, a figure in the back, but more hauntingly, it was a mannequin, not a real person. My first thought was who in God's name would drive around with a lifelike doll in the back seat? Admittedly, we got a good laugh out of this for a moment, but then the paranoia of the situation came back in full force. Robbie continued to call out, "Hey, if anybody needs assistance, we can help you." There was no response still. This is when I noticed this mannequin had something in its plastic hands. It looked like some sort of VHS tape or something. Without thinking, I grabbed it. I didn't even tell my friends until later that night. We decided to call the police, which we should have done in the first place. We reported this abandoned car. The police asked for the license plate number, and that's when we noticed that it didn't have one. Whoever had ditched this car either didn't have plates or had taken them with them. All they left behind was a creepy mannequin and an old VHS tape. We made our statement and told the cops the location of the vehicle. Then we headed home. Later that night, while we were talking about this incident and just how strange it was, that's when I told my friends about the tape I'd taken from the car. In a sort of shock and perhaps a bit upset I hadn't mentioned it before, they of course wanted to see what was on it right away. On the sticker in front of the tape, there was a plain white sticker which only said "Watch Me" written in black marker. There was also a very crudely drawn skull and bones. I had some pause, but decided that we had to watch it. Curiosity was really getting the better of all of us in this moment. I found my parents' old VHS player in the crawl space and hooked it up to the TV. The tape began with about 5 seconds of black screen, just the sound of the static tone. Then though, a man walked on screen with a beard and long hair. The quality was quite horrible. He stared into the camera, almost as though he were staring right at us. He stared into the lens for 2 minutes straight, without saying a single word. We watched the whole time. It was the most unsettling 2 minutes of my entire life. After those 2 minutes, he laughed. Then it sort of morphed into a crying sound, all while staring directly into the lens. Finally, he said in this sort of low, monotone voice, "This tape belongs to me, and I know you have it. I'll find you again, and then you'll be sorry." He followed this with another horrible laugh-cry combo. We fast-forwarded the tape for several minutes. Nothing else was said though, other than a few laughs and this strange man staring at the camera. Finally, it abruptly cut to black and ended. After a bit of conversation about the situation, being stupid kids, we decided not to hand over the tape to anyone. We just kept it. After all these years, the tape still sits in my bookcase. I'll never watch it again, of course, and I've never really spoken about it until now, writing it down. I'm sure it's some kind of stupid joke, but to us kids, it was burned in our brains for years after. I'm still kind of scared by the mental images I witnessed that night. Every time I see a man that resembles the man from the tape, even after all these years later, I get a funny feeling in the pit of my stomach. I'm reminded of the fear and paranoia I felt that evening. Why did they have a mannequin in their back seat? Why did he crash his car? And why did he leave that tape there?